Well, President Trump started February off hot, signing an executive order on the Second Amendment. But what exactly does it mean for California gun owners? Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel today. That is right, we keep finding reasons in 2025 to be optimistic about the Second Amendment and the course that lies ahead for us. This one has to do with the executive order that Trump signed at the beginning of this month. To walk us through that, we have brought on the CRPA legislative director. He is also the host of Firing Line Radio. You can find him every Saturday at 1 p.m. on AM 590 The Answer. Of course, that is Rick Travis. Rick, thanks for being on with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And guys, as always, it is working. It's 2025, and this is the time to make gains, and we are certainly pushing for those gains to happen. We're not going to let off the throttle. We are going to continue our efforts in advocacy, and you can help by subscribing and liking these videos. It's a great way for you also to directly contribute to that Second Amendment litigative and legislative efforts that are happening throughout the state. So please, if you can, it helps with the algorithms. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to these videos. So, Rick, let's just jump into this really quick. I wanted to read a part of this executive order. It's section 2, the plan of actions, and then sort of talk about some of the potential that it has. So section 2 reads like this. Within 30 days of the date of this order, the Attorney General shall examine all orders, regulations, guidance, plans, internal agreements, and other actions of executive departments and agencies to assess any ongoing infringements of the Second Amendment rights of our citizens and present a proposed plan of action to the President through the Domestic Policy Advisor to protect the Second Amendment rights of all Americans. In developing such proposed plan of action, the Attorney General shall review at a minimum all presidential and agency actions from January 21 through 25 that purport to promote safety but may have impinged on Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, rules promulgated by the Department of Justice, including the ATF from January 21 through 25 pertaining to firearms and federal firearms licensees, agencies' plans, orders, and actions regarding the so-called enhanced regulatory enforcement policies pertaining to firearms and or federal firearms licensees, reports and related documents issued by the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, the positions taken by the United States in any and all ongoing and potential litigation that affects or could affect the ability of Americans to exercise their Second Amendment rights, agencies' classifications of firearms and ammunition, and processing of applications to make, manufacture, transfer, and export firearms. So I know that was a mouthful. And Rick, I'm gonna kind of look to you to break that down for us here. It's certainly nice to see this come out of the current administration. I know that amongst the things that Trump campaigned on, the firearms portion was something that he was criticized more than other things on. So it's kind of good to see him take a focus on this and sign the executive order. As far as this plan of action is concerned at the federal level, can you break down exactly what this is saying and what we might see come out of it?
Yeah, sure. So this obviously goes to the Department of Justice for the investigation, review, and making recommendations. That would be Attorney General Pam Bondi, which within the Second Amendment community is somewhat controversial because Pam Bondi, when she was the Attorney General for Florida, wasn't seen always as being supportive of the Second Amendment, and for some good reasons that she's seen that way. So there is some trepidation amongst Second Amendment community members on, well, now it's going to be the test of Pam Bondi to see how much she's going to support what the president has said. I'm pretty confident she will. Here's where this is going to come down, Kevin. There's two different lines of attack in here, if I can use that term. One is to look at regulations that were promulgated during the Biden administration. An example of those would be what the multimedia outlets have put out as, quote, ghost guns. There's nothing ghost-like about any firearm. What there are do-it-yourself kits. And I think one of the things our community forgets that Donald Trump doesn't, because lots of us have talked to him, his son, Don Jr., and others in his administration, that do-it-yourself kits are not new. Like, newsflash, they're not even new as in like 25 years old, 50 years old, 100 years old. In fact, do it yourself is older than, well, the country, because people have been putting firearms together. In fact, one of the very first things that George Washington patented and said was the right of Americans to put, assemble their own firearms, create their own firearms, do things like that. So this is a long-standing tradition that the Biden administration tried to vilify as ghost guns, tried to gin up a lot of fear mongering and remove that possibility from anybody ever learning how to do that or being able to work in that area. We also call them more colloquial in California 80 percenters. So you may have heard that term used. This is a ruling that he will have Pam Bondi look at to say, okay, how do we work this out? Like, do I totally like roll it back to before Biden did anything in his administration? Do I modify that or do I maintain it? And those are going to be the recommendations that's going to tell us the tail of the tape, like in that example. Other examples would be like the expanded background checks. And from Californian perspective, we've been dealing with this for a long time. But the fact is, in the majority of the other states, they don't deal with it at all. So that is something that we're also going to have to see is if she tries to bring a national scheme of that, which could have impact on states like California. What we all have to realize is if the Attorney General says, hey, this is the limit of background checks, great. But in California, just like we've seen with multiple other policies, there's going to be states that are going to fight back, whether they're Attorney General like Bonta, who, as you know, Kevin, has about $50 million in his war chest thanks to the legislature in this state and the governor. He may decide to countersue and say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to comply. We're going to see how well that works out for them. It also deals with the ATF. And I think you're going to see a lot of recommendations come out against the ATF. There's been some talk about getting rid of the ATF, but ATF had developed under the Biden administration a zero tolerance policy. And, I can see where anti-firearms advocates see that as a huge victory, but, zero tolerance doesn't work anywhere. Let's just be honest. If you say to your spouse, your friends, I have a zero tolerance that if you ever do X, I'm throwing the book at you. Well, humans are humans and mistakes are made. It's the intent behind those acts. And so the zero tolerance removes that intent where before agents can look and go, that was an obvious clerical error. Oh, there was a fire. Oh, there was this, whatever the issue might be. So there'll be that. Defense of the gun laws is huge. But I think one of the biggest things too in this that a lot of people are missing is under the Biden administration, groups like Giffords, Brady, the list goes on, Everytown, helped create in the White House, literally sitting inside the West Wing, the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Use taxpayer dollars. I'm sure when Doge gets done going through all this stuff, we're going to see stuff like was done with USA, which meant we were not only fighting for our rights to maintain our Second Amendment rights, our God-given constitutional rights, Kevin, but our opposition trying to strip of those rights was getting funding from the federal government in an office inside the White House. Trump did remove that on day one, as he promised, which was the first thing to our community. But now he's saying, hey, I want all the reports, I want all the research, and I want it vetted, and I want to find out what the lies were, and I want to find out who's behind it. So when that report comes out, I think that's going to be a time that you and I will get back together and talk with people here on the channel, because that is going to be huge. I think you're going to start to see like the 11% excise tax that's being ramroded across the country got its birth there and definitely got some funding there, because that's part of it. And that's part of what we're looking at as the funding mechanisms, along with this executive order and a couple of others that dovetail into it, is that we have been fighting, as you know, Kevin, in the Capitol, groups of people who claim to be volunteers, but yet you and I stayed in a hotel where many of them were and heard firsthand how their airline tickets, their hotel, and their food was all being paid for with taxpayer money. That's not cool.
Yeah, definitely seeing the result of that. And then kind of as a result of this administration, a lot of transparency, you end up realizing that, yeah, we weren't crazy. They were being funded and we did hear correctly. You kind of, well, I guess, so as far as I can tell, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong here, essentially what this is ordering is information to be gathered. Information to be gathered so that the administration can take a look at it and see what they want to do about it. Kind of translating that into something else that you touched on, and how we as Californians are going to be affected. I mean, take this channel, for instance. There's a lot of things just last year in 2024 that the ATF came out with, the federal DOJ came out with, some things that came out of the White House that Californians pay a little bit less attention to, just because the legislation that's in this state, or a state like New York or perhaps Illinois, is so far ahead of Congress and the legislation that they bring forth. So when you apply this to a executive order, what is the potential for affecting California citizens that you see in it?
Well, there's probably about three things right now that I'm focused on. One of those is going to be, nationally, and also here in California, we have what I'm just going to call this ridiculous age issue that we fight all the time in our capital. It's like last year I heard arguments that a young girl at the age of 10 to 12 has the capability to understand if she's supposed to have promiscuous relationships with anybody that could lead to pregnancies, and are completely capable of doing that with anybody of any age. Oh, but until she's 30, she's not capable of understanding what a firearm is. Really? Really? But she is capable at 18 of joining the military and carrying a firearm, unless she comes back to California. Then she can only carry it when she's on the base, but not, you know what I mean? Like this variable ethic of when someone is responsible and trained well enough versus when they're not. And so this is one of the things that's highlighted in this executive order, is looking at the age limits that the Biden administration tried to set up this weird patchwork nationwide, which includes California. That is going to be examined. And then what we could see is a federal order coming down saying, no, 18 is the age, because you're an adult, you can vote, you can do all this stuff. Or maybe it's 21 and they couple it to the drinking age. But somewhere in there is where that's going to lay. So that could have an impact. The other big impact is anybody that follows us on the channel knows we have huge cases like the Rhodey v. Bonta, Duncan v. Bonta, and the list goes on. So all those cases, as you have reported on numerous times, Kevin, on this channel, were impacted by the 2022 Bruen decision and New York State Rifle Pistol Association v. Bruen. That specifically is highlighted, and that all the Second Amendment lawsuits triggered by the Bruen decision that expand firearms rights. So that would be like Rhodey and Duncan. He wants those reviewed. And if he feels that they tried to play games by sending them all the way down and have them go up this, he may come out, and Bondi may come out and say, no, the courts at the lower end, which would be like in our case with Judge Benitez, that's the ruling. So, how that's going to play out, because obviously courts are challenging everything that this president's trying to do, because it's political activism, and that's the real constitutional crisis that's in play right now, not all the stuff that the mainstream media is trying to push. They're obviously not covering it because, let's be honest, mainstream media has gotten a ton of funding from the left side of the government. And that is coming out, and that should tick people off, because that's where this comes all to home.
Well, yeah, and I'm sort of curious how you think, or at least what kind of potential you see here. And I would point specifically to Doge, which you mentioned earlier. Is something that seems to be working pretty quickly. It's sort of starting to create an expectation of American citizens where it's going in, it's looking at things, and then action is immediately taken. We saw that with U.S. aid. The transparency of the financials came out. People were laid off. The doors were closed for a little bit, just altogether. And then, more recently, the head of USAID ends up being let go. Do you see the potential for something like that to happen with this executive order? I guess, when you mentioned the lawsuits, it seems like that is something that could be done pretty rapidly. What's the potential that we actually have here once the information stage is over and then the action starts to happen?
Well, I think we could play this out. The positive points are we could see some very quick decisions, or some very quick channels to get to those decisions develop as a result of this. They've got about a little more than 20 days as of today to produce all this information. So I'm sure, like everything else this administration is doing, they're working around the clock. I'm sure there was forethought given to this, and there were people already working on some of these things in anticipation of this executive order. I think, like we've seen in several of the executive orders, that as those reports come out, there could be new executive orders because the executive branch has the right to do that. Um, I think you will see some movements probably both at the federal and at state levels. People try to fight back with that. So, in some cases, and this is where you would need like a big talk group, but I mean, from a legislative standpoint, I think the legislators are a little bit more limited than they have been in years past in Sacramento, but I still entrust them not to try to find some quirky way to get around it, like a Duncan decision or a Bruin or a Rhodey decision. But it's going to be much more out in the open, much more in front of the taxpayer of how much money they're spending. And that may cause enough people to say, we're not going to vote for this. No, we're not going to do it because now's not a good time with everything else going on. So I'm optimistic. I think this is a great, in my book, second step. The first step was obviously kicking out the Office of Gun Violence Prevention out of the White House. And I was very happy to do that on day one with an executive order. This is a good second step, and I'm anticipating steps 3 through whatever that we're going to be going through. But I think this administration is really showing that it's not the Second Amendment. They're about the entire U.S. Constitution that has been maligned and abused for over a decade by the Democrats.
Well, I want to ask you one final question. You mentioned that there could be lawsuits that follow once the action actually starts. I want to ask you your final thoughts on the 2A executive order as it stands, but also, can you play that out for us? If there is action taken by the current administration and a state like California comes out and sues, does that have the potential to just halt enforcement of something in California for the entire nation? Can you walk us through that, how that would play out?
I think a good analogy that we're seeing play out right now is, obviously the president signed executive orders that he's going to collect, and I want to make this really clear. People who came here adverting willfully, knowingly, the process to immigrate to this country, which meant they came here illegally, which is what makes them an illegal alien is a criminal. They broke federal law. Many of those have also broken other laws, both in their country of origin and here, that include everything from thievery to murder and everything in between. The president signed an executive order that said they're going back. We're cleaning them up. We're getting them off the streets. We're getting rid of the cartels. We're getting rid of the gangs. And 77 million Americans voted for that. The president, in his ability, signed executive orders directing the departments involved in that, from Department of Defense to Department of Justice to, ICE, etc. Go after them. And now we have cities here in California and a government in California that says we're not going to cooperate. And now what we're seeing is Pam Bondi, as the Attorney General, saying, watch what happens if you don't cooperate. If you actively help out, which there is a lot to suggest at the time of this video being done, that there have been actors here in California that have forewarned gangs, forewarned people to get out of the way before an ICE raid, that those people are going to be arrested and prosecuted. And so I think you would see similar things happen to those that resisted these kind of tactics.
But I guess, fortunately, it doesn't necessarily put a stop to the agenda just because a state like New York or California ends up challenging or, for lack of a better term, rebelling against the agenda as it is. So I guess, what are your final thoughts here? I mean, it seems like this is overall a lot of upside. Obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, not just at the federal level, but at the California state level as well. What are your final thoughts on this?
My final thoughts is, we've talked about this for a long time, Kevin. This is draining the swamp. And part of the swamp has been dedicated to coming after the American citizen, removing their constitutional rights, specifically the Second Amendment. As we clean the swamp, we are going to find all sorts of stuff that is not going to make us very happy. In fact, we're going to get angrier. I actually have a bumper sticker now that says, "We the people are pissed," because I think that's important for people to realize we're upset. We're going to get more upset. And then there's going to be the cleanup process, which means, we're going to have to go through layer by layer by layer of government and those working in it to find out what those connections are to make sure that we remove any elements of it's like removing a cancer. Sometimes you go and have the surgery and then you have to go ahead and treat it with other things to make sure you killed all the bad stuff around it. We are going to have to go through layers of removing people from government who have been doing the American people wrong, especially when it applies to the Second Amendment.
Well, something certainly that we are going to follow along with. And hey, guys, if there is potential here to get the implementation of some good decisions we've seen in lawsuits, we are definitely going to be there for it. Like I said, a lot of upside here, so we're looking forward to that. Rick, I want to thank you very much for coming on with us today and sharing.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And guys, as always, and once again, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to these videos. It's a great way for you to directly contribute to 2A litigative and legislative efforts here in the state of California. And it is what helps us work just as far as getting the algorithms to get this message out there as far as it can go. As always, our aim here is to educate on the 2A litigative, legislative, and cultural efforts here in the state. Thanks again, guys. We'll see you on the next one.